glad to be here this morning. I appreciate everybody that bared with us last week in my attempt to do our lesson from not at church. And I told Macy and Brian I really appreciate all they do. I've said that every morning since we've been doing it, but I really, really do appreciate it because it's really frustrating when it's left up to me and Felicia to make it happen, and just with the internet and everything else. And so I do appreciate all that Brian and Macy do very much. And on the same note, Michael, appreciate what you do as far as getting everything set up. Thank y'all so very much. But anyway, just glad to be here this morning. As far as ever since March, these new ways of doing things, it was very different teaching like this to start with, and then last week to actually just talk to a phone without having anybody there, that was even more hard. So I know we're just like everybody else, anxious for everything to get back to normal, and when we can come together and do our Sunday school and be together and hear everybody's remarks and comments and just have the interaction. I sure miss it very much, but I also, on the same notion, I'm thankful that I think we're doing the prudent this week, this month, that our country, our nation has never been through anything like we're going through right now. And so when we talk about this whole idea of the first part of our summer quarter of hope, I can't think of a better message that we could bring each and every Sunday morning as we look at the book of 1 Peter and talk about this idea of hope. Because truly we need hope right now more than ever before. On the other hand, we hear going back to that same point that, nothing like this has ever happened, and what our country's going through, there's never been a time like this, and it's maybe in our lifetime, there's never been a time like this, but guys, certainly there's been times and struggles that the world has gone through, that Christians have gone through, that will make the suffering and the problems that we have today seem minuscule. And I think it's this book, as Peter is writing this letter, the audience he's writing this to truly knows something about hard times. These people were being terribly persecuted for their faith in Jesus Christ. And yes, the day and times that we're going through right now are hard and they're struggle, but the audience that Peter wrote this letter to, they were struggling very much as well. So I think as we put it all in perspective and see what Peter has to say, I think it's just very, very important and very pertinent for this day and time. But again, going back to this idea of the endurance of our hope, and the point being we can endure suffering because of our hope in Christ, our first question is, when have you needed endurance to complete a task or goal? And I don't know if anybody that's here this morning out in the churchyard, if y'all wanted to give an example, but when have you needed endurance to complete a task or goal? Everybody's quiet, so and it's hard if any of you are watching. Our families are so scattered out, and the folks that are here, so it would be hard to even hear if somebody did want to give an example. But I want to share one, and I'm going to take up a pretty little time right here going over my example, because I'm going to tie it back into our verses in our lesson. But as Felicia and I talked about this last night, if you go back to this question, when have you needed endurance to complete a task or goal? And my comment was, Felicia didn't disagree, but my comment was, it seems like everything we do as a Joyce family requires endurance to complete that task. But the one thing that really sticks in my mind is this whole running thing that Felicia and I embarked in 5 or so years ago, and it all started with Felicia decided she was going to try to start running, and I thought, well, for several reasons, number one, I guess deep down I didn't want my wife to be tougher than I was, so that was part of the reason that I started running, and then together and just the idea of trying to be physically fit, and so we started with this thing called a Couch to 5K. Some of you have heard it, and you went and you would run a minute, then walk like 3 minutes, and run a minute and walk 3 minutes, and you would do that for a week, and then you went to running a minute and a half and walking in the different times. And we built ourselves up till, finally, I'll never forget the time that we ran it straight. And that just seemed like such an unattainable goal when we started, but yet we did it. And about that time, Felicia says, I want to sign us up to run a half marathon. And I thought it was the craziest thing. There's no way we can do this. There's no way. But yet, we did. And in order to make that happen, we did a lot of running, and you had to late at night after everybody went to bed, and we would run, and the way that training worked is that typically, we ran 5 miles on Monday and 5 miles on Wednesday and 5 miles on Friday, and then you had to do a long run on Sunday, which was, started out at like 6 miles and then went to 7 miles and then went to 8 miles and went to 9 miles and went to 10 miles, and you get my picture, and that's how we did every week. And trying to fit the time in to do it, and there was a lot of angry words, there was a lot of tears in trying to make that happen, but we did it, and of time and commitment, and there again, tears and angry words, but then there were a lot of happy times too. But I want to use this as an example when you look at setting a goal and then it taking endurance to complete it. It wasn't just the physical endurance. In fact, I think Felicia would agree with me, the mental endurance was probably more than the physical endurance was. When you think about this idea of running 26 miles, you think, well, all that that's just your body. It really wasn't. It was training your mind to do it, and that it is possible, and to of time, the hurdles of hurt feelings, the hurdles of hopelessness, and it can't be done, and we're wasting our time to start with, and we overcame those hurdles and completed our goal. And I'm not, by no means, I am proud trying to use that as to put me and Felicia on no pedestal. But what I want to use this as an example of life, right? Because during our life, we set goals, and we set things that we want to accomplish. But, in order to meet those goals, it takes a lot of skill and effort to make it happen. And in doing so, a lot of times, we want to quit. I don't know of anyone that's ever set a goal and not at some point during the process of accomplishing that goal haven't wanted to quit. And so as we look at this parallel of setting goals, of running a marathon, and we parallel it to our everyday life, and especially, guys, especially in this time that we're living in right now, hopelessness can set in. This idea of wanting to quit can set in. This idea of, I can't do it. I mean, is there anybody out of 3 months says, I just can't do it no more? Has anybody, am I the only one that's thought that? And we all have. We've thought, I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. I'm tired. It's not, is it worth it? How many of us think that? Is our goal worth what we're putting into it? I know when Felicia and I was training for the marathon, we thought that many times, didn't we, baby? Is this worth it? Is it worth the time, the energy, the stress that it's putting on us? And in life, the time that we're dealing in right now, the thoughts that are crossing people's mind is, is it worth it? Our state, our country opened back up, and folks were allowed, but now, the disease is spreading, and so things are closing down. We're supposed to wear a mask now, and the thought comes into your mind at our supper tables: when is it going to end? Has anybody had that conversation at supper? When is this going to end? Is it going to end? Is this the new normal? Is this what we're going to have to? We have those thoughts in this day and time. Those are conversations that we're having. And as we get into the book of 1 Peter and see what Peter is telling these Christians, these early Christians, can you imagine putting yourself in their shoes? They believe in a religion that's 10 years old. They've never met Jesus. They've met Peter, or they've met someone, or they've read a letter, or they've heard preaching about this man Jesus. There's no church. There's no foundation like we have now. And yet they're being persecuted. They're being killed. They're being crucified. Their leaders, as we know, Peter, the author of this book that we're getting into, Peter was crucified upside down. And there's a point in time that they think, is it worth it? Can you imagine their thoughts? Is this worth it? Am I doing the right thing? Is what I'm doing hopeless? And so, as we get into our lesson this morning and go to this point, we can endure suffering because of our hope in Christ. And let's look at our verses. Is there any discussion before we get into our verses this morning? I truly wish that, and I look forward again to the time when we're back in the church and in the sanctuary and we could have talk, because I feel like as we talk about the lesson this morning and we talk about these points, I think if we were in a place that we could hear each other talk, there would be a lot of thoughts that pertain to this. But anyway, does anybody have anything they want to add? All right, we're going to get right into our verses, and we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. And verse 8 says, "Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil." And so Peter says, and I thought about going back and hitting verses 1 through 7 of chapter 3, but I'm not. I want to say that those are the verses, and Peter is asking that wives submit to their husbands, and is asking husbands to set up their wives, and that's so important. And it's kind of in a different context if we look at verses 1 through 7 of 1 Peter chapter 3 than what Paul used. Peter's using it as an example. If we remember last week's lesson, the end of last week's lesson, the end of chapter 2, and Peter is calling upon us to submit to authority. And then when he starts out in chapter 3, he's asking wives to submit to their husbands, and he's asking husbands to love their wives. And that is so important. But what Peter's really using verses 1 through 7 of chapter 3 is this idea of submitting in a way to bring others to Christ. And he's tying that into a submitting of the authorities that are over us, or that are put over us, that we talked about last week, ending verse 2. And he's doing it in a way to bring others to Christ. And so specifically he says, as a Christian wife, you submit to your husband who isn't a Christian. Therefore, you're showing him love to bring him to Christ. The same thing at the end of chapter 2. Peter says that we submit to the government authorities so that they will, they'll see the good works that we do and the way that we live, and therefore will bring others to Christ with us. And so, as a wrap up to that, we see ourselves here in verse 8. And so Peter says, finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren, be pitiful, be courteous. Peter's saying, finally, we're going to submit. We're going to submit to our authorities. But finally, importantly, if you will, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love each other. Love as brethren. Be pitiful, which pitiful here is not what we think of the word pitiful, but pitiful means tender-hearted is the Greek translation of that. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous. So he's saying, finally, do these things. Finally, be of one mind. Finally, have compassion one of another. Finally, love as brethren, meaning love everyone as brethren as we do our brother. Be pitiful, be tender-hearted, be courteous. He says in verse 9, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing. But on the contrary, blessing is what he's saying there. Knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. Peter says, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but on the contrary, but contrariwise blessing. Knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. Peter's saying that the way that we bring others to Christ, the way that we change this world that we're living in, the way that we change the circumstances that we find ourselves in, is that we are all of one mind as Christians, that we are one mind. And what mind are we in? As Christians, this one mind, we are to mold ourselves to the mind of Christ. And that we all try to mold ourselves that way. We do that, and then we also have compassion one for another. To have compassion one, to love one another. To love as brethren. To be tenderhearted, to be courteous. To not render evil for evil or railing for railing. You know, right now, if you get on social media, is this what you see? What Peter's talking about right now? Do we see this idea of being kind to one another, compassion to one another, loving as a brethren, tender-hearted, courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing? There's a question in my book right now that says, how do the teachings in these verses compare and contrast with the values in our culture? They don't compare very well, do they? The teachings that Peter is saying right here do not compare to the teachings, to the values in our culture today. And as Christians, Peter's calling us out to change our mindset, to be kind, to be of one mind, to have compassion, to love, to be tenderhearted, to be courteous, not to render evil for evil or railing for railing. And some of you are sitting there saying, well, how does that have to do with enduring suffering because of our hope in Christ? And we're going to get there. But then Peter says, but contrariwise, on the contrary, blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you should inherit a blessing. Instead of rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, we should look for opportunities to bless. Look for opportunities to bless those around us. No matter if they agree with us or not. No matter if they've done us wrong, but that we still strive to look for opportunities to bless those that are around us. And he says, strength of mind, and the second commandment's like it, to love our neighbor as ourselves. If we can love because he first loved us. And it goes back to this idea of we can bless others because we were blessed and we have the inheritance of a blessing. Verse 10 says, for he that will love life and see good days let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil. You know, how much of the problems that we face in this world right now today are caused from those that don't refrain their tongue from evil? Can we think about that for a minute? How much does evil thought and evil tongue and evil words and evil actions, how much does that make our days worse? How much does that bring down the world that we live in? And Peter's given the contrast to that. He says, for he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. If we can truly refrain our tongue and truly refrain our lips, you know, Peter goes back and he's using I don't know that he intentionally, but it's the same thought process of the book of James and what James used about the tongue being so deadly, right? What we say is so deadly. You know, words, the damage they do takes a long time to heal. I've always said, and I really believe this, that a lot of the problems that we have in society today are because they don't let boys fight no more in school. You know, my cousin and I, who was my best friend growing up, we fought a lot. I mean, a whole lot. And the boys have heard all my stories. And I mean, but yet 30 minutes later we were best friends again. But nowadays they if you get in a fight at school, you're suspended, you're expelled, and so all this tension just builds up, right? And there's these evil words that get spoken. And there's and all these things, and it never heals. It just keeps on. But if you just let them go out in the yard and fight, and then they're going to be okay, right? Because Bobby and Mike and Brian, when we growed up, that's how it worked, right? I mean, I don't think I'm making something up. You went and you got in a fight, and then, you know, a day later, well, you was buddies again. Or you realize maybe I shouldn't use evil words to that fella because he done stomped me into the dirt. So I'm going to watch what I say. But these you know, nowadays you can't do that. And so, you know, just this tension builds and it builds, and evil words get spoken, and these evil words hurt and they cut deep. There's no doubt that the tongue and the words that we say hurt far worse than getting punched in the head. Would everybody agree with me? The words we say and the hurt that they cause are far more damaging than any physical hurts that we get. And Peter is saying, just as James said and warned us about, refrain your tongue from evil, refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. And if we do that, going back to the top of verse 10, for he that will love life and see good days. If we want to love life, if we want to see good days, then we refrain our tongue from evil. And then he says in verse 11, let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. It says, going back to the verse 10, for he that will love life and see good days, let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. Let us seek peace. Seek peace. And then verse 12, for the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to the Lord is against them that do evil. And I want to end right there with these group of verses, and we'll go to the discussion. But you see right here in verse 12, he's dividing up teams. And I don't know a better way to say it. He's dividing teams up. It says, for the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. So there's two teams, right? There's the teams that are righteous, that do the will of God, that try to do what Peter's saying right here. And then there's the teams that don't. And it says the eye of the Lord is on which team? The team that tries to do righteous, right? And that means the eye of the Lord is against the team that doesn't. And so, I guess what Peter, and I think when you look at these verses, is what we're trying to see is, okay, I'm just going to throw out the devil advocate here. I'm going to throw out the Jason mindset. Verse 8 says to have compassion of one another. Verse 8 says to love our brethren. Verse 8 says to be pitiful, tenderhearted. Verse 8 says to be courteous. But Jason's flesh says, I'm going to have compassion to those that have compassion to me. Jason's flesh says, I'm going to love those that love me. Jason's flesh says, I'm going to be tenderhearted to those that deserve it. Jason's flesh says, I'm going to be courteous to those that are courteous to me. And if we go into verse 9, Jason's flesh says, I'm going to render evil for evil. If somebody does evil upon me, I'm going to do what upon them? I'm going to render evil. It goes back to the story. Eli don't even remember it, which breaks my heart to some degree, because it's been such a mind-changing statement he made when he was a little feller. And it was right after, I know I've shared this in Sunday school before, but it was right after ISIS became big. And, you know, in today's time, we've almost forgot what ISIS was with all the other things we're dealing with. But, you know, ISIS had come out in Iraq and in the Middle East, and they were gaining ground, and they had gathered a bunch of Christians and had them on the beach, and I believe it was 21 of them that they beheaded this day. And they videoed it, and we were talking about this at supper, and I was so mad. And I said, I wish, you know, we sent special forces in there, and they ought to pick up every one of those folks that videoed that, and they ought to behead them on a video too. And that's what I really felt. And Eli said, Daddy, if we did that, we'd be just like them. Think about that statement that boy made to me when he was about 6, 7, 8 years old. If we did that, we'd be just like them. But yet, that's what my flesh wants to do. My flesh wants to render evil upon evil. My flesh wants to rail against those that rail against me. But Peter's saying, on the contrary, we're to bless. Because knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. When I bless those that do evil upon me, I do it because I know I've inherited a blessing. When I love those that don't love me, I know I do it because I've inherited a blessing. When I have compassion on those that don't have compassion to me, I do it because I've inherited this blessing. And it goes back to a couple weeks ago. You know, Jesus Christ died for me when I was still yet a what? A sinner, right? Christ died for me when I was a sinner. He didn't die for me once I was saved. He died for me when I was still a sinner. When I was still of the flesh, that's when he died for me. And to think that therefore I should only love those that love me is completely opposite to what Christ done for me. Is there any discussion before we go on? In our next group of verses, in verse 13, we're really tying into this thought that we ended on verse 12 of the two teams, right? And 1 Peter chapter had been bodily and physically harmed. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't have friends. They couldn't congregate. They were persecuted to the point of death because they believed in Jesus Christ. But Peter says here, and who is he of that which is good? And you can imagine some of those folks say, well, wait a minute. I'm being harmed. I'm being harmed. But then Peter says in verse 14, but, and if you suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are you, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. Peter's saying, if you are if you suffer for righteousness' sake, be happy, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. Guys, this is going back to the point when we can endure suffering because of our hope in Christ. Whatever it is that we're doing, whatever it is that we are troubled or under right now, we can endure it because of our hope and promise. They are two teams, right? There's the teams that are for Christ, and there's the team that's against Christ. And we know how the ending is. We go back to last quarter's lesson, and we was looking in the book of Revelations. And we see that at the end, He will wipe away all tears. There'll be no more suffering. There'll be no more pain. We have that promise. And we have that promise because of Jesus Christ and what He did for us on that cross. And so Peter says, but, and if you suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are you, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. And I want to go just right into our next group of verses, and we'll open it up for discussion after that. Because verse 14 ties so much into the rest of the chapter here. But 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 through 17 says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. For it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. And I want to go straight to verse 17, because I ain't got a lot of time, and then we're going to tie that back into verses 13 and 14. Look what verse 17 says. Verse 17 says, for it is better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. Think about what Peter's saying there. I'm going to read it one more time. For it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. And the point I want to make and pull out of these verses, is there anybody that lives in this world right now that hasn't suffered? How many of you think anybody's ever been born that hasn't suffered in some degree? Does anybody think so? I feel like because we live in a fallen world, because we live in this worldly world, there's no human being that's ever lived that hasn't suffered. And Peter's point here is, for it is better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. Do you see what he's saying there? We're all going to suffer. If I turn my back on Christ, if I live by Jason's flesh, guess what? I'm going to suffer. If I live with Jesus Christ in my heart, and if I follow everything that Peter's outlined up until this point, guess what? I'm still going to suffer. But what Peter's point is, for it is better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. Do you see what he's saying there? If we go back to verse 12, it says, for the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against. Yes, I'm going to suffer in this world. And knowing in this promise of the hope in Jesus Christ, and this fact that, going back to verse 12, the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous. Do I want to suffer under the eyes of the Lord, knowing that he's got his hand on my shoulder, knowing that he's there ready to wipe away my tears and pain and suffering? Or do we want to suffer, as Peter says, evil doing, as those that do evil, of the world? And those are the only two options that we have. And Peter's using that to the folks here in Asia Minor, in Turkey, He's saying, guys, I know that you're suffering right now. I know that it's not easy. I know that it's hard. I know that what you're going through, you want to quit. You want to throw up your hands. But we are suffering for doing well. And by doing that, we have Jesus Christ, going back to verse 12, with the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are upon our prayers. God is with us. And then going to verse 4, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you. This hope, this promise of Jesus Christ and what he did for us and what we have waiting for us. We have that promise. So the options are that we live with that promise and we follow through with these teachings of Peter and Jesus Christ, and to love one another and to not pay evil back with evil, and live that way so that the righteousness of God will be upon us. We live with this hope. And then it goes, having a good conscience in verse 16, that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. If we strive to live our lives that way, if we can live our lives, people will be ashamed that they falsely accuse us of our good conversation in Christ. Can we make folks ashamed that they falsely accuse our good conversation? If what we say, if the way we act, if what we put on our phones, can that make folks ashamed because they would ever talk bad about us and what we say about Christ? And that's what the challenge Peter's given us. And then in conclusion, if we look there in verse 17, for it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. Guys, it's better to suffer for doing what's right, because you're going to suffer regardless. Let's make this decision to suffer to do what's right. Let's make this decision to love one another. Let's make this decision to have compassion on one another. Let's make this decision to live tenderheartedly and to be courteous. Let's make this decision to not render evil for evil or railing for railing. Let's make the decision to look for a way to bless those in every circumstance. And let's do that in a way to help mold us to know that we can endure the suffering that we face because of our hope in Jesus Christ, and show others that as well. Is there any discussion or anything before we close this morning? If not, as we live it out this week, the first point is to surrender. Choose to see your life and circumstances from God's perspective. Acknowledge the Lordship of Christ and trust. Listen to that. Choose from God. Acknowledge the Lordship of Christ and trust Him regardless of the actions of others. And there's one point I want to add to that. We touched on it just a little bit a week or so ago. Guys, we have got to quit basing our actions on other people's actions. We base our actions on Jesus Christ. We love others because Christ told us to love them. We've got to get away from, if I love someone, they should act a certain way in return. Do you get what I'm saying? We've got to love without strings attached. Christ loved us without strings attached. It goes back to this point. Acknowledge the Lordship of Christ and trust Him regardless of the actions of others. Trusting Him regardless of the actions of others means that we love others as Christ did regardless of their actions. The next point is to bless. If someone has treated you like an enemy, or you have treated another person that way, seek to bless that person with love, compassion, and humility. Then defend. Ask the Lord for opportunities to display and defend the hope that is in you. When the Lord opens that door, be ready to verbally testify of your hope in Christ. And so as we close this morning, I just challenge us to live out these 3 points as we go through this week: to surrender, to bless, and to defend. Thank y'all. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next week.